Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to be working on the Sienna. This is my wife's daily driver and she doesn't really pay attention to much of the maintenance on the car. It's almost got 100,000 miles on it. It's a 2015, so we've driven it for about 7 years now. And I noticed recently that the brakes were wearing down because there's a big ass groove in the rotors. It wasn't making any squeaking noises or anything because usually they have the warnings on them that make the squeaking noise. It just ended up metal to metal. Today we're going to be changing the front rotors and pads. I'm going to go ahead and change the rear pads while I'm at it. They look kind of thin also. And at the end of it, I'm going to go ahead and bleed everything. For the bleeding part, I might do a separate video just dedicated on bleeding it and changing the fluid. So stay tuned. So for the rotors, I got brand new OEM Lexus rotors. I bought these from Lexus. Lexus and Toyota Siennas use basically the same rotors. These are used on the Lexus RX, they're used on the Highlander and several of the other larger SUV and van type vehicles. So I just ordered it from Lexus because I order stuff from them all the time and they had the best prices. If you guys need these same rotors, go ahead and check out the links down in the description to Lexus's eBay store. They also have their own parts store website, so you can check them out there also. Both sides use the same rotors. You just order the same part number and it'll work on both sides. For the pads, I should be using OEM pads, but I had these Pro Stops from Pep Boys from a couple years ago. I think I only paid $10 or $15 for each set, and I'm just go ahead and use these for now. If they don't work well, if they dust too much, I might change them to OEM pads later, but for now, since I already had these, I'm just go ahead and use them. We'll go ahead and get the van up on the lift. I got my Max Jacks all lined up. I love this Max Jacks. If you guys haven't seen my video on installing these Max Jacks, go ahead and check out that video. We'll go ahead and get the arms lined up, lift this thing up and see how high it can go. So this is the first time lifting my van on this lift. I've got it all the way up to the top lock on the actual columns and the van barely clears the ceiling. Look at that. I barely have room back here where the tray ceiling starts. And then over here where my tires are mounted, I've got like a ½ inch or a 1 inch clearance for the mirror, and the actual bar that hangs over barely clears the car. But I went ahead and put my tripods down here as an extra safety precaution. I just put them right on the arms. They're right at one of the locks, so some of the pressure's on the actual tripod and some of it's on the lock. I know most of you guys doing this DIY probably don't have access to a lift like this, but this does make freaking working on brakes and suspension so much easier. If you're working on the driveway on the jack stands, I feel for you. I mean, I've been through that all my life until now when I got this lift, but overall, I love this thing. So you guys can see here the scoring right here from the pad going metal to metal, or that little actual warning piece that didn't really make any noise on our rotor. If you look on the other side, it's starting to do that too. It's always good to check the thickness of your pads right here. You can usually see it with the wheel off down this way. If you can see it with a flashlight, you can see how thick it is and how much meat you have left. This is on the passenger side. You can see it's starting to do the same scoring right here, and then these little high and low spots. These rotors were kind of garbage to begin with anyways. There was a recall back in the day when this first came out that was still under factory warranty, because these things, they would heat up when you're going downhill, especially if you live in a mountainous area, and these things would get really warped and your wheels and your steering wheel would shake like crazy coming downhill when you actually applied the brakes. But once it cooled down, it went back to normal again. So these things needed to be replaced anyways. So usually if you were just to change the pads without changing the rotors, you would just unbolt this bottom right here, which is a 14 on the slide bolt, and you could just flip the caliper up. And once you flip the caliper up, you have access to the pads. Just take those out and then put the new pads in after you press the piston back in, and then close it back up and bolt it on. So it's one bolt. But since we have to change the rotors, we have to actually take apart the 17 back here. 2 17s, one down here, one on top. Then you could take the whole caliper and bracket off as one piece, and then you could do your rotors. So I'll go ahead and show you guys both ways on this caliper. That way you can do it based on what you're doing for your brakes. All right, so we're in here now. I'm gonna go ahead and show you guys the easy way if you didn't have to do the rotor. So you just wanna pop off this 14 right here. Make sure you're in the loosening position. It's a pretty easy bolt. It sometimes will spin, so you'll need a 17 to hold the inside here while you unscrew it. Usually once you get inside, you want to check the grease inside your slide bolts to make sure they're not seized. Depending on where you're at, especially if you're up north, you want to re-grease those. So once you have that, you can just flip this guy up on the same hinge, take off your little springs right here that hold it. You might need to save the springs for your new pads. And you pop the pads right off. Looking at the pads, they're not worn down all the way the metal to metal yet, so what was rubbing was the edge here. So you can see how easy it is just to do the pads only without doing the rotors. Just that one bolt right there. So next thing with the pad only change would be to push your pistons back in. You'll need a clamp and probably a piece of wood. In my case, I'm gonna just use the old pads, put it right there, and just clamp it back down to push the piston in. If you guys didn't know, the reservoir on all these cars are designed where when it shows minimum up top, these things are all the way out, which is an indication that the pads are low. So usually when you don't want to top off your brake fluid, you want to just make sure that you have brand new pads. It's on full, that way it's an indicator. All right, once we get in here, we want to use a C-clamp. That's the easiest way to close this thing because you get the most leverage. Probably put a block of wood or something back here if you don't want to scratch up your caliper, which really doesn't matter.
Huh? If I pull the seats up and at least in the jumper.
All right, once we get this in here, just turn your C-clamp and it'll close the piston in. Once you get one started, it should be easy on the other end. So you just want to get it in as much as you can and maybe move it to the top one. Just don't damage your rubber seal. All right, you can see we pushed it all the way back in flush. You want it flush because with the new pads, they're pretty thick. And they're gonna need every millimeter they can to be able to close it back on, especially with new rotors. On here, you can see I still have a little bit of dirt and grease in here. I'm gonna spray some super clean in here, clean this all up before I put it all back together though. So next thing we're gonna do, we're gonna go ahead and take apart the bracket. So it's a 17 millimeter right back here. Just this one might be tight, so you might need something to get you some leverage, like a little bar. So unscrew that top one. Go ahead and get underneath for the bottom one. You might want to get some bungee cords or something to hang this once you unbolt it though. That way it doesn't dangle from the brake line. All right, next thing we need to do to take the rotor off, we want to put a screw in here to push the rotor out. Especially if you're up north, this thing's going to be all rusted and corroded onto the hub. So you'll need a bolt. This is basically a 12 millimeter bolt, which uses a 12 millimeter head. I think it's an M10 1.25. So you just find one of these bolts in your bucket of bolts. Go ahead and just thread it into there by hand, and then just turn it until it pops out. Once you get everything off, clean up anything you need around here, especially if it's dirt and grease and brake dust, just to get it clean again and put your new rotor on. All right guys, we'll go ahead and put the new rotor on. I wiped down most of the brake dust and cleaned it with some super clean. Put the new rotor on. Make sure everything sits nicely onto there. Put the bracket back on, and bolt it in. And then once we bolt the bracket in, we can flip that thing back up, put the pads on, and call it a day on this side. All right, I've got the new pads all laid out right here. If your pads didn't come with these things clipped in already, which are the wear indicators, you want to make sure the indicators are on opposite ends so they actually wear down from the top, which is over here. The one I took off, it actually wore on the top down. So you want to make sure it's the same on here. The one other thing I might do is, I don't like these shims right here, the factory shims, or like a double shim on. I'm gonna go ahead and remove these ones off here and put in the factory ones once I clean those up. As you see, when I was reassembling this pad, I was putting this brake quiet on there. Put a little bit too much on this side. On that back side one, I put just enough so it didn't squeeze out. So this one squeezed out when I pressed on it. So just make sure you wipe that clean. But overall, we got it all mounted back in. Make sure everything's clipped in. Don't forget your 2 little spring clips here before you lay down the caliper. You should be good with this. As I mentioned earlier, if you're up north or your car's a little bit older, you want to check your slide bolts and make sure they're greased properly. And then you got enough grease in there so they don't seize on you. Mine's pretty greased, but I'm gonna go ahead and just put some anti-seize. I've got this assembly lube that I use for engine stuff. Put a little bit of that onto here, just enough to grease it up again. We'll go ahead and do that for both bolts on all the slide pins. Spin it in there just to get it all around and get it into the boot. There, any excess, just wipe it off with a rag. Before you put it back together, don't forget your springs. Once you do that, want to close this thing back up. Make sure the springs are in there nicely. You want to also get the threads on this guy right here greased up too so it doesn't seize. You can see it's kind of all this, whatever they used on it before, or just the oxidation over time. The bolt with the grease on it, go ahead and put it in. Tighten it down. Go ahead and do this top one and grease it up. All right, got everything bolted back on, nice and tight. Make sure you tighten it down. Everything's in, the springs are in, almost forgot those. And pretty much everything's done on this side. So I'm gonna go ahead and do the other side time lapse, and then we'll get to the back. All right, so we're back here on the rear. What you want to do on the rear is the same as we're going to do on the front. I'm not changing the rotors on this. I'm going to go ahead and just unbolt this 14 right here. There is a 14 on the other side to keep it from spinning. We're going to flip this up, change the pads, put it back together, and call it a day back here. All right, so the rear pads, they're nice and all, but they didn't come with the wear indicator, so I'm gonna have to pop the wear indicators off the old ones, put them on here. I'm gonna do the same with the shims. I wanna use the OEM shims versus the Power Stop ones that came with these pads. So I'm gonna pop those off too and put those on. All right, I was able to transfer everything over. I put the brake quiet on here. It squeezed out a little bit, but we're good. On the rear, we want to put the indicators on the bottom because of the caliper. The caliper on the back is on the back side, so it's trailing. So you want to make sure that on the rotation that the wear indicator is on the front edge of the spin. So to put it in, you just flip it up. Can't flip it as much because the tube right here is kind of blocking it. It's just enough to get the pad in there and seated. So you just want to slip it in there sideways, get it between the shims and the springs on the edges. And you want to get the other side on the same way. Make sure your wear indicators are correctly positioned in. Everything's nice and clean. On my boot, it looks like it has some air in it. Put a screwdriver here and loosen the edge where it tucks into a piston a little bit to get some of the air bubble out. Right there, I put the screwdriver kind of right there on the lip of the edge of it to take the seal off the piston, and I got that thing to go back in like an accordion so it doesn't touch the actual pad when it goes in there. So next, I want to pull the actual slide bolt out and re-grease it just like I did the front. Got everything bolted up, cleaned up, and put the anti-seize into the boots. I'm gonna go ahead and time lapse the other side, and we're gonna finish this install. All right, boys, so we got this side done. So now I'm gonna go ahead and bleed the brakes. I'm gonna have a separate video on showing you guys how to bleed the brakes just for the sake of time. So if you wanna check that out, go ahead and look into the videos of my channel. Hey guys, thanks for tuning all the way to the end of this video on changing the brakes on the Sienna. As you can see, it's a pretty straightforward process. I did it on the lift, which made it a little bit easier on my back, but you could easily do this at home using jack stands and a hydraulic jack. And you don't really need to have all 4 wheels up at one time. You could do each corner at a time if you have the hand tools at home to do it. If you haven't subscribed to my channel to stay on top of all my different DIY content, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Turn on bell notifications to get notified every time I upload a video. Remember guys, for all these different DIY projects, whether it's on the house, on the car, or in the garage, if I can do it, you guys can do it. I want to thank you for watching all the way to the end, and I'll talk to you guys next time.